The wagon wheel snapped clean off its axle on a Tuesday morning in April of 1873, and Mary Vaughn did not cry, did not curse, and did not ask a single soul for help, even though there were 3 men standing not 40 feet away watching her try to lift the corner of a fully loaded freight wagon with nothing but her own 2 hands and a prayer she had already half given up on. She was 26 years old, had been running her late father's dry goods supply route through the hill country of central Texas for going on 8 months, and she had learned in those 8 months that the moment a woman showed weakness on the road between Fredericksburg and the settlement camps beyond, she would never be taken seriously again. The 3 men watching her were Muleskinner types, rough-handed and loose-shouldered, and 2 of them were already grinning in that particular way that made her jaw tighten so hard she could feel it in her ears. The road she was on was the old Gillespie County trace, a red dirt ribbon that wound through cedar breaks and limestone outcroppings, and was, in the spring of 1873, one of the busiest supply corridors in that part of the hill country. Ranchers pushing north, settlers pushing west, freighters and peddlers and the occasional cavalry dispatch rider all moved along it, and the dust never entirely settled before it was stirred again by another set of hooves or wheels. Mary had inherited the route, the wagon, and 2 sturdy mules named Abel and Cain from her father, Robert Vaughn, who had died of a fever the previous August, leaving behind nothing but the business, a modest account at the Fredericksburg Bank, and a reputation for honesty that Mary was determined to hold onto even if the honesty part did not always make the money part easy. She had no brothers. Her mother had died when she was 12. She had an aunt in San Antonio who wrote letters suggesting she come down and find a husband before she turned 30, and Mary answered those letters with polite patience and a firm internal conviction that she would rather haul flour sacks through a hailstorm than sit in a parlor waiting for a man to decide her worth. So when the wheel went, she assessed the situation with the same calm deliberateness she applied to everything. She had a spare wheel. It was strapped to the underside of the wagon bed. She would need to unload half the freight to lighten the load enough to lever the axle off the ground, and she would need a proper jack or a heavy branch and a fulcrum stone, and then she would need to wrestle that iron hub free of the broken wheel and onto the new one. It could be done. She had seen her father do it twice and had helped once. She could do it alone. She pulled on her work gloves, walked to the rear of the wagon, and began unstacking crates of canned goods onto the roadside with methodical efficiency. "You need a hand with that, miss." The voice came from her left, and she did not look up. She knew without looking that it was one of the grinning Muleskinner men, and she also knew the tone, which was less genuine offer and more the preamble to a series of comments about how a woman had no business running freight alone. "I do not," she said. "Wagon wheels broke clean off," the man said helpfully, as though she might not have noticed. "Yes," Mary said. "I can see that." She kept unloading. The man said something to one of his companions, and there was laughter, and then the sound of their boots moving away down the road, and then silence except for the cedar wind and the patient breathing of Abel and Cain. She had the freight half unloaded when she heard another horse on the road, not the skittering quick pace of someone in a hurry, but the long, easy canter of a rider who was going somewhere and was confident enough in the going to take his time. She did not look up. She had discovered that if she kept her eyes on her work and her hands busy, strangers on the road were more likely to pass without stopping, because stopping and watching a person work without helping was uncomfortable enough that most decent people either helped immediately or kept riding. This one stopped. She heard the horse slow, heard the creak of leather as weight shifted, and then the sound of boots landing in the dirt about 10 feet behind her. She set down the crate she was holding, turned, and regarded the man standing by the road. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or 2 either side of it, lean in the way of men who worked outdoors and ate when there was time for eating rather than when there was inclination. He wore a plain canvas duster the color of old straw, a hat that had been good once and was still serviceable, and a belt with a holster that held a Colt single action that looked like it had been cleaned recently, even if nothing else about him had been. His horse was a big gray quarter horse with a blaze face, and it stood with the patient stillness of an animal that had put in a great many miles and was accustomed to waiting. The man's eyes were a particular shade of light brown that the afternoon sun was turning almost amber, and he was looking at her wagon with the assessing squint of someone who had fixed broken wheels before and was already working out the arithmetic of this particular one. "Keep moving," Mary said. It was not unkind exactly, it was simply direct. He looked at her then, and something in his expression shifted, not to offense and not to amusement, but to something more careful, a kind of attentive consideration that she was not entirely used to receiving. "Name is Stephen Ralston," he said. "I did not ask," she said. "No," he agreed. "You did not." He looked at the wagon again, and then he walked, not toward her, but around to the far side of the wagon where the broken wheel lay in the dirt like a ruined clock. He crouched down and looked at the axle, and ran his thumb along the housing, and nodded slightly to himself. "I am going to say something," he said, "and I want you to know that I am not saying it to be useful in the kind of way that makes people feel managed." She crossed her arms and waited. "That axle housing has a hairline crack about 3 inches from the hub collar. If you lift the wagon without bracing it, the whole axle is going to shift, and you are going to lose that housing entirely. And then you will not be 2 hours behind schedule. You will be 2 days behind schedule waiting for a smith." She looked at him steadily. "How do you know I am behind schedule? Loaded freight wagon on a supply trace with a broken wheel," he said. "I assume there is somewhere you are supposed to be." She walked around the wagon and crouched where he had crouched and looked at the axle housing, and after a moment saw exactly what he was describing. The crack was thin but distinct, and she understood immediately that he was right, and she felt the particular interior frustration of someone who has been prepared to do something hard and competent, only to discover that the problem is worse than it appeared. She stood up. He was still crouching, and he looked up at her with that same careful attention. "What are you suggesting?" she said. It was not precisely a question. "I have a metal wedge in my saddlebag and enough wrap wire to stabilize that housing temporarily. If you let me brace it before you lift, the jack will hold and the axle will not shift. It will get you to Careville, which I believe is where the nearest smith who can do the proper repair would be." "You believe," she said. "I know," he said. "Ben Holly's. Best ironwork in the hill country. Tell him Stephen Ralston sent you, and he will not overcharge you for the labor." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon was moving, the sun tilting west over the cedar breaks, and she was calculating distances in her head. Careville was 20 miles. She needed to reach the Whitaker settlement before dark, which was 12 miles beyond Careville, and that was already going to be tight even if the repair went perfectly. "I can do this myself," she said. "I know you can," he said, and there was nothing in his voice that suggested otherwise. "But you will do it faster and safer with the brace, and I have the wire and the wedge, and the offer is not contingent on any opinion of mine about whether a woman ought to be running freight alone." "I have no such opinion," she studied him. "Everyone has such an opinion." "I have an opinion about whether a person knows their business," he said. "You know yours. The axle housing is a separate matter." She made the decision quickly, because she was a practical woman and practicality had always been her anchor. "All right," she said. "Do the brace. I will handle the rest." He did not say anything further. He went to his saddlebag, took out a short iron wedge and a coil of heavy wrap wire, and came back to the axle and began to work with the steady competence of someone who had done similar things many times. His hands were sure and unhurried, and he did not make a production of the task, did not offer commentary or instruction, simply worked. Mary went back to unloading freight. She got the wagon light enough, and she retrieved her jack from beneath the driver's bench, and when she came back around, the brace was done and he had stepped back and was standing at what felt like a deliberate distance from the wagon, not hovering, not waiting to be thanked, just standing there as though he had nothing better to do than watch the cedar trees. She set the jack. She levered the axle up. The housing held. She went to work on the hub collar, and it was stubborn but not impossible, and the new wheel went on in 35 minutes, which was respectable time even with two people. When she stood up and knocked the road dust from her gloves, he was still there, and she found that she could not quite summon the usual mild irritation she felt at people who lingered. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "North," he said. "Same trace, more or less." "Business in Careville. Passing through," he said. "I am on my way to the Comanche Springs area. There is a horse I have been asked to look at." She understood then that he was likely a horse trader or an evaluator of some kind, which explained the quality of his own animal and the assessing manner he had brought to the axle housing. A man who spent his days estimating the soundness of horses developed an eye for structural problems in general. "Thank you," she said, and the words came out correctly enough, but something in them was slightly stiff, which she knew was her own habit reasserting itself. She had never been good at gratitude that had an audience. He seemed to understand this too. "Ben Hollies," he said again. "Tell him the Ralston name. He will do right by you." He tipped his hat, a proper gesture without any theater to it, turned to his horse, mounted in one smooth economy of motion, and rode north up the trace. She watched him go for perhaps 5 seconds, which was 4 seconds longer than she had intended, and then she turned back to reload her freight. She did not think about him again that day. Or more accurately, she told herself she was not thinking about him, and this was mostly true except for the 3 or 4 moments on the road when the brace wire on the axle caught the late sun at a particular angle and reminded her of the quiet efficiency of the man who had put it there. Careville in the spring of 1873 was a small but growing town, fed by the cattle trade moving north and the settlement traffic moving west, with a main street of about a dozen businesses, a courthouse that was still being finished, and a general ambition that had not yet been tempered by hardship. Ben Hollies' smithy was at the south end of Main Street, and when Mary drove in that evening and told the big, sooty-armed man behind the forge that Stephen Ralston had sent her, his whole face reorganized itself into something more generous. "Stephen Ralston," Ben Hollies said, nodding slowly. "Where did you come across him?" "On the trace," she said. "He braced my axle housing." Ben Hollies looked at the brace and let out a short, approving sound. "That is Stephen's work, all right. Clean and economical. He could have been a smith if he had not liked horses better." He looked at the housing more carefully. "I can have this proper by morning. You can stable the mules with Marcus 2 doors down, and there is a hotel called the Ritter House at the north end of the street that is clean and reasonably priced, and is run by a woman who will not let the rowdy element through the door." She took all of this in and thanked him, and felt the echo of her earlier stiffness, and made herself mean the thanks more fully this time. The Ritter house was exactly what Ben Hollies had described. Mrs. Ritter was a German woman of 50, with the bearing of someone who had survived several different kinds of hardship, and come out the other side with a clear philosophy about cleanliness and order. She gave Mary a room on the 2nd floor with a view of the street and sent up hot water without being asked, and Mary ate supper in the small dining room and listened to the sounds of Careville at night, the piano from the saloon 2 blocks over, the distant complaint of cattle, the wind off the hills, and felt, for the first time in several months, something that was not quite loneliness but was adjacent to it. She was not lonely for company in general. She preferred her own company to the company of most people, but there was a particular quality to the silence after the Ralston man had ridden away, something slightly less than complete, like a sentence that had been left at a natural pause rather than at its full stop. She recognized this as foolishness and went to bed. In the morning, Ben Hollies had the axle done by 8 o'clock and charged her fairly, and she was back on the trace with a good wheel and a properly repaired housing before the dew was off the cedar. And she told herself very firmly that the episode was closed, and the man named Stephen Ralston was now simply an entry in the small mental ledger she kept of decent people she had met on the road. The Whitaker settlement was 12 miles past Careville, and she arrived there by mid-morning with the full freight order, which included flour, salt, gun oil, lamp oil, coffee, tea, 3 bolts of calico, a crate of assorted tinware, and a set of harness leather that old Garrett Whitaker had been waiting on since January. She unloaded everything into the settlement's common store, which was run by a lively and perpetually exhausted woman named Clara Whitaker, Garrett's daughter-in-law, who was 28 and had 3 children under the age of 5 and the organizational efficiency of a military quartermaster. "You came alone again," Clara said, noting this without particular judgment. "I always come alone," Mary said. "There was some talk," Clara said carefully, "that Tom Delacroix, who drives the Fredericksburg to Careville run, was going to try to buy your route from you." Mary went still for a moment, then continued setting down the harness leather. "He tried," she said, "twice. I told him twice what he could do with the offer." Clara smiled at this. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met, and I mean that as the highest possible praise." "People keep calling it stubbornness," Mary said. "I call it knowing what is mine." She stayed for a meal and the conversation of the settlement, which she found she valued more than she would admit. The straightforward exchange of news and opinion between people who were trying to build something in a landscape that did not particularly care whether they succeeded or not. There were 11 families in the Whitaker settlement, mostly German and Anglo stock, with 2 former freedmen families who had come west after the war, and were in the process of quietly proving to the surrounding community that their presence was a benefit and not a threat, which they should not have had to prove, and which Mary said so plainly to Clara over the dinner table. Clara agreed. "Ellis and Ruth Webb are the best farmers in this valley," she said. "Better than my husband, who, I say this in the kindest possible way, plants things and then forgets where he planted them." Mary laughed, and the sound surprised her a little, the ease of it. She had not laughed like that in some weeks. She left the settlement in the early afternoon to begin the return trip to Fredericksburg, and the road south was long and warm, and she let herself think, which she did not always do, about what the spring and summer schedule would look like, whether she could add another settlement to the eastern part of the route, whether the bank account was healthy enough to consider a second mule. She had been driving for about an hour when she heard the sound of a horse coming hard from the north behind her, and she looked back along the trace to see a man on a gray horse closing the distance with a purposeful speed that suggested something had either gone wrong or was about to go wrong. She recognized the horse before she recognized the rider, the big blaze-faced gray, and then she recognized the canvas duster, and she felt something entirely inconvenient happen in her chest before she could address it. Stephen Ralston brought the gray up alongside her wagon and matched his pace to hers, and he was not in panic, but there was a tight alertness about him that told her the speed had not been casual. "Mary Vaughn," he said. "How do you know my name?" she said. "Ben Holly's," he said. "And before you get stiff about it, I'm not here because of your name. I am here because there are 2 men about 4 miles up the trace behind you who have been following freight wagons out of Careville for the past month. They hit a peddler named Good in February and left him on the side of the road without his goods, his horse, or 2 teeth." She looked at him steadily. "And you know this how?" "Because Good is my cousin," he said, "and I have been watching for those men since March. I saw them leaving Careville this morning about half an hour after you left, and they were not shopping for provisions." She considered this. She had her father's old Remington rolling block rifle under the driver's bench, and she knew how to use it, and she was not a woman who frightened easily. But she was also a practical woman, and practical people recognized when a situation had more factors in it than one person could manage alone. "What do you propose?" she said. "There is a homestead about a mile ahead on the east side of the road," he said. "Belongs to a man named Prout. If we pull in there together, 2 people with a clear line of sight, those men will not stop. They are cowards who work on isolation." "All right," she said. He rode alongside the wagon without crowding it, and he did not tell her to hurry or slow down or take a different line through the road. He simply rode, and the gray horse moved easily in the dust, and after about a quarter-mile he said, without particular emphasis, "You made good time to Whitaker." "I always do," she said. "Ben said you were up early." "Ben Hollis talks a great deal for a man who works with loud equipment," she said. He made a sound that she took a moment to recognize as a suppressed laugh, and she found she did not entirely mind that she had caused it. The Prout homestead appeared around a cedar bend, a modest but solid structure of limestone and timber with a good fence line and a water trough out front, and a man in the yard who turned out to be Jonah Prout, who was 60-something and weathered like old fence post, and entirely unsurprised to have two strangers pull into his yard with a story about roadmen following freight wagons, because Jonah Prout had been living on this trace for 14 years and nothing surprised him anymore. They waited there for 40 minutes, and the two men on the road behind them, when they came past, did not stop. They rode past at the sight of the wagon in the yard with two people standing beside it and a rifle visible against the fence, and they rode past without incident and disappeared around the next bend. "That is the Culver boys," Jonah Prout said, watching them go. "They have been trouble since the fall. Sheriff in Careville knows about them but has not had cause to act." "He will," Stephen said, and there was something level and certain in his voice that made Mary glance at him. She had not asked what his plan was regarding those men and his cousin, and she did not ask now, because some matters were private and she understood that better than most. She thanked Jonah Prout, who offered coffee and was refused politely because the afternoon was moving, and she got back on the trace with the gray horse and its rider still alongside her. "You do not need to ride all the way to Fredericksburg," she said. "I know," he said. "I am going back to Careville. I just want to see you clear of the likely range of those men." "That is about 3 miles," she said. "Yes," he said, 3 miles. They rode in silence for the most part, which was a comfortable silence in a way that surprised her. She had always found extended silence with strangers awkward, or rather she had always found that strangers found it awkward, and then tried to fill it with conversation that she did not particularly want. But Stephen Ralston seemed to have no discomfort with quiet, and she found herself in the odd position of being the one who spoke first. "What do you do with the horses?" she said. "After you evaluate them." "Sometimes I buy and resell," he said. "Sometimes I am hired to assess for someone who cannot make the trip themselves. Sometimes I break young horses for ranchers who do not have the time or the patience for it." "Which do you prefer?" He thought about this, which she appreciated because she disliked people who answered important questions without thinking first. "The breaking," he said. "A young horse is a conversation. You are learning what is in it, and it is learning what is in you. And when you get to the end of that conversation and there is understanding on both sides, that is about as satisfying as anything I know how to do." She thought about that. "Where are you from originally?" "Missouri," he said. "Came south after the war. You?" "I was born in New Braunfels," she said. "My father came from Virginia before I was born. I have lived in this part of Texas my whole life." "It shows," he said, and this was a compliment of a particular kind, the kind that acknowledged belonging, that recognized the difference between a person passing through a landscape and a person shaped by one. She looked at him sidelong. "What shows?" "The way you handle the trace," he said. "You know which crossings run high in spring, and you know where the road shoulders are soft, and you know which settlers give water without question and which ones you do not stop at. You know this country." "My father knew it first," she said. "I learned from him." "Good learning," he said. They came to the point where the road forked, the east trace to Fredericksburg and the north trace back to Careville, and he brought the gray to a slow halt. She pulled the mules to a stop. "You will be all right from here," he said, and it was a statement but with the slight upward quality of someone who was making sure. "I will be all right from here," she confirmed. He nodded. He looked at her for a moment in that careful, unhurried way he had, as though he was reading something that required proper attention. "I will be in Fredericksburg in about 2 weeks," he said. "I pass through regularly. if you have need of anything." "I do not generally have need of things," she said. "No," he agreed, "but if—" She held his gaze for a moment and felt the inconvenient thing in her chest again, which she addressed firmly and without ceremony. "If," she said. He tipped his hat and turned the gray north and rode away, and she watched him go for longer than 5 seconds this time, and she did not have a reasonable explanation for why, and she did not attempt to construct one. She drove back to Fredericksburg through the late afternoon and arrived as the town was settling into its evening routines, the storefronts closing their shutters, the smell of cook fires and cedar smoke, the particular amber quality of hill country light in the hour before dark. She stabled the mules and went to the modest house her father had left her on the west side of town, and she made herself a supper of fried eggs and bread, and sat at the table in the kitchen where her father had once sat, and she was aware of the dimensions of the quiet in a way that she had not been in some months. She thought about what Clara Whittaker had said about Tom Delacroix wanting to buy her route, and she thought about the axle housing and the wire brace, and she thought about the quality of amber in a man's eyes in afternoon light, and she thought about what it meant to have a conversation that felt like a conversation rather than a negotiation, and then she cleared her supper things and went to bed and slept well, which she considered a reasonable response to an unreasonable day. The following 2 weeks were busy ones. She ran 2 short supply trips, one to the Bergman homestead southeast of town, and one to a new ranch being established by a man named Aldous Crane, who was building something ambitious on the Pedernales River, and needed more hardware than she usually carried, which meant renegotiating her freight capacity and her pricing with the hardware merchant in Fredericksburg, a process that required the particular combination of charm and steel that she had been refining for most of her adult life. She also received a letter from her aunt in San Antonio, which she read twice because her aunt had a way of writing that was simultaneously loving and infuriating, and then set aside to answer when she had more patience. Tom Delacroix came into the dry goods store where she kept her billing ledger and made a third offer for her route, and this time she looked at him with a steadiness that she had been told, by various people over the years, was slightly unnerving, and she said, "Mr. Delacroix, if you come to me a 4th time with an offer for something that is not for sale, I am going to start charging you for the interruption." Tom Delacroix was a man of 45 who was not accustomed to being addressed this way by women or by anyone, and he went slightly red in the face and left, and the dry goods proprietor, a small neat man named Heinrich Bauer, watched this exchange from behind his counter with what appeared to be silent admiration. "You know," Heinrich said carefully, after the door had closed, "he has tried to buy out every independent freight operator in this county over the past 3 years." "I know," Mary said. "He has succeeded with most of them." "He has not succeeded with me," she said. "No," said Heinrich, "he has not." She filed the interaction away under the category of unpleasant but manageable, which was a large category in her experience, and went about her work. On a Thursday afternoon 14 days after she had stood at the fork in the Kerrville Trace, she was in Heinrich Bauer's store checking her next order against the supply list from the Whittaker settlement when the door opened, and a man walked in, and she knew from the sound of his boots before she looked up who it was. Stephen Ralston took off his hat as he came through the door, which was the standard courtesy and meant nothing particular, and he looked at the store with the evaluating glance she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him, a man who walked into any space and immediately understood its layout and contents. "Miss Vaughn," he said. "Mr. Ralston," she said. Heinrich Bauer looked between them with the particular alertness of a man in a small town who understood that these things were worth paying attention to. "I need to order a 20-pound salt block and 4 pounds of coffee beans," Stephen said to Heinrich, and then to Mary. The Comanche Springs trip went well. The horse was everything it was described to be. "Good," she said. "I heard you had trouble with Delacroix," he said, which was not entirely to the point but was also clearly not accidental. She looked at him. "Ben Hollies told you." "Ben Hollies and 3 other people," he said. It is a small road between here and Careville. And what is your interest in my troubles with Delacroix? He seemed to consider how to answer this with the care he brought to important questions, and she found herself holding very still in a way that she usually only did when she was listening to something that mattered. He bought out a Sagoods route, Stephen said, after the Culver boys robbed him. I'm not saying Delacroix sent the Culver boys. I am saying the timing was convenient. She set down her supply list. The store was quiet except for the scratch of Heinrich Bauer doing something discreet and industrious at the back counter that involved a great deal of not looking in their direction. You think he is running a scheme, she said. I think it is worth being careful, he said. And I think you already know this because you are not a woman who has missed the pattern. She had not missed the pattern. She had been turning it over in her mind for weeks, the way Delacroix's offers had come just after her hardest runs, the way certain information about her schedule seemed to reach him faster than it ought to. She had not spoken of it because speaking of it without proof was simply complaint, and she did not make complaints she could not substantiate. What do you know about the Culver boys? She said. They are currently in the Bixar County Jail, he said. My cousin identified them when he recovered enough to travel to San Antonio. They are going to be there for some time. Something loosened slightly in her chest. Good, she said. Delacroix is a separate matter, he said. I know, she said, but I have been keeping records. Every route change, every scheduled deviation, every time he came to me with an offer and what had happened to me in the weeks before. I have it in a ledger. He looked at her with that careful amber regard, and something in it was warm in a way that made her need to look back at her supply list. Will you have supper with me? He said. The question was quiet and direct and not dressed up in anything, and she appreciated the lack of dressing and also found herself momentarily without a prepared response, which was unusual. Heinrich, she said without looking up from the list, is the Continental Hotel still serving those pork chops on Thursdays? They are, Heinrich said from the back counter, sounding pleased with himself for being included. She looked up at Stephen Ralston. The Continental Hotel, she said. At 7. He nodded once, and she went back to her supply list, and he completed his order with Heinrich. And then he left, and Heinrich made no comment whatsoever, which was so uncharacteristic of him that she almost laughed. Supper at the Continental Hotel on a Thursday evening in Fredericksburg in April of 1873 was a respectable affair, which was to say that there were several other people in the dining room, and no one paid too much attention to a woman and a man eating at the same table. Or if they did so with the subtlety that a public dining room required. Mary wore her one good dress, which was dark blue wool with small buttons at the cuffs, and she put her hair up with more care than she usually bothered with, and she caught herself checking her reflection in the window pane and felt briefly irritated with herself, before deciding that taking care with one's appearance was not weakness. It was simply courtesy. Stephen Ralston arrived 2 minutes before 7 in a clean shirt and a coat that he had clearly pressed with some effort, and the sight of the effort touched her in a way she had not anticipated. They talked over supper the way two people talk when they are genuinely curious about each other rather than performing curiosity, which is to say they talked about things that actually mattered to them, and they forgot to eat for long enough that the pork chops went slightly cold, which neither of them minded. He talked about Missouri and the war years, not extensively but honestly, and she understood that certain things about him had been formed in the heat of that period in a way that could not be undone, only acknowledged. She told him about her father and the route and the bank account and the ledger she was keeping on Delacroix, and he listened in the way of a person who hears both what is said and what is underneath what is said. "You are the most careful person I have met in a long time," he said. "Careful in the good sense. Careful as in you think before you move and you know why you are moving. My father used to say that a person who acts without thinking is just weather," she said. "Weather is not an agent, it is just a condition." He was right, Stephen said. He was often right, she said. That was one of his more irritating qualities. He smiled at this, and it was a full smile, not the suppressed half-thing she had seen on the road, and it reorganized his face into something that she decided she liked very much and then told herself she was being sentimental. She was not being sentimental. She was being accurate. She knew the difference. They walked after supper along the main street in the early evening cool, not because it was arranged, but because neither of them was ready to end the conversation, and the street was a natural extension of it. He asked about the Whitaker settlement and about Ellis and Ruth Webb, and she told him, and he listened with genuine attention. There are a lot of people in this territory who have come a great distance to build something and do not get the fair treatment they have earned, he said. Yes, she said. That is a truth that wants addressing, and most people prefer not to address it. You address it. I try, she said, within my range, which is not very wide. It does not have to be wide, he said. It has to be honest. They stopped at the corner near the livery, and the night was settling soft and cool around them, and a mockingbird somewhere in the nearby oak was going through its repertoire with the dedicated energy of a creature that has important things to say and unlimited time to say them. I would like to see you again, Stephen said, when I am in Fredericksburg, and when I am not, I would like to write to you if you are willing. She looked at him for a moment in the lamplight, this deliberate and quiet man who had braced her axle without calling it help and ridden alongside her without calling it protection, and asked her to supper without calling it anything but what it was. You may write to me, she said. And when you are in Fredericksburg, I expect you will find me in Bauer's store or on the road, and you are welcome to supper. He smiled again, and she let herself look at it this time without immediately looking away. Good night, Mary, he said, and her name in his mouth had a particular quality, not soft exactly but careful, like something he was holding properly. Good night, Stephen, she said. She walked home in the lamplight, and the mockingbird continued its performance behind her, and she went to bed and lay awake for longer than she ought to, which she considered entirely justified. The letters began the following week. His first letter was from Uvalde, where he had gone to look at a string of horses for a ranch near Del Rio, and it was direct in the way his speech was direct, containing observations about the landscape and the people he had met, and a paragraph at the end about the Axel housing that made her laugh out loud in the kitchen, alone, on a quiet Wednesday morning. She wrote back the same evening, from the kitchen table, by lamplight, and she was surprised by how much she had to say, which ought not to have surprised her since she had always had a great deal of thoughts. Only the people who usually read her letters were her aunt in San Antonio, who was lovely but limited, and Clara Whitaker, who was excellent but always slightly too busy to write at length. Stephen Ralston read carefully and wrote carefully and asked questions that were not obligatory questions but genuine ones, and she found herself looking forward to the post in a way she had not since her father was alive, and wrote her letters from his supply trips. He came through Fredericksburg again in May, and again in June, and each time the supper at the Continental became a longer conversation, and each time the walk after supper covered slightly more ground, and each time something between them grew more articulate without being named, which was both pleasant and slightly maddening, which she found in a quiet corner of herself to be appropriate, because she had never been a person who wanted things to move faster than they were ready to move. In July, two things happened in close succession that changed the shape of the summer. The first was that Tom Delacroix, apparently frustrated by his failure to acquire Mary's route through negotiation, attempted to acquire it through a different method, which was to approach the Fredericksburg Bank and suggest to the senior lending officer that the Vaughn freight account was undercapitalized and represented a credit risk, and that the bank might consider calling in the small operating loan that Robert Vaughn had carried and which Mary had been paying reliably. This was a lie, elaborately constructed, and it came to Mary's attention through Heinrich Bauer, who heard it from his brother-in-law who worked at the bank, and she went to the bank the following morning with her ledger, which contained not only 3 years of payment records in her father's hand and 8 months in her own, but also, in the last 40 pages, the careful documentation she had been building of Delacroix's pattern of behavior. She laid the ledger open on the bank manager's desk, a man named Horatio Webb, no relation to the Whittaker Webbs, and she walked him through it methodically. And when she was done, Horatio Webb looked at the ledger and then at her and said, in the tone of a man who is reassessing several things simultaneously, "Miss Vaughn, your account is not at risk, and I think Mr. Delacroix and I need to have a conversation about the nature of the information he provided." The second thing that happened in July was that Stephen Ralston arrived in Fredericksburg not in transit, but with his saddlebags packed for a stay of more than one night, and he came to find her at Bauer's store and told her that he had decided to base himself in the hill country for a time rather than ranging as far as Del Rio, because there was enough horse work in this part of the territory to keep him occupied, and the ranging was wearing on him, and he said, looking at her with the careful amber regard that she had by now learned to read quite fluently, there were other reasons. She looked at him for a long moment across Heinrich Bauer's front counter, with Heinrich industriously pretending to reorganize a shelf of lamp wicks about 3 feet away. "Other reasons," she said. "Other reasons," he confirmed. She thought about the months of letters and the suppers and the walks and the quality of the silence between them on the road that first evening when he had ridden alongside her through the cedar brakes. She thought about the wire brace on the axle housing and the way he had done it without making a production of it, without requiring her to ask, without making her feel managed. She thought about the word careful and what it meant applied to a person, which was not timid and not reluctant but something more like deliberate, the way you were careful with something that mattered. "There is a room at Mrs. Trotman's boarding house on the east side of town," she said. "Clean and quiet, and her cooking is better than the Continental. Tell her Mary Vaughn sent you." He smiled, and she let herself look at it again without any internal commentary at all. He took the room at Mrs. Trotman's, and he was in Fredericksburg for the better part of August, working horse contracts with 3 different ranches in the surrounding county, and he was good at his work in the visible, unshowy way that she recognized from their first meeting, the way of a person who knows what they are doing well enough that they do not need to announce it. She watched him sometimes when he did not know she was watching, which was a thing she did not generally do and would not have admitted to easily, but there was something about the way he moved around horses and around people that was worth paying attention to, a fundamental gentleness that was not softness, the way a good river is not weak because it bends rather than breaks. In the evenings they talked on the porch of the boarding house in the long hill country dusk, or at the Continental, or walking the back streets of Fredericksburg, where the German settlers had built their houses with the particular care of people who intended to stay. And the conversations ranged across everything from the state of the range grass to the politics of Reconstruction to what kind of life a person wanted to have. And on that last subject they talked with an honesty that surprised them both. "I am not going to become someone who does not have a business," she said one evening. "I want to make that clear. I have heard stories about women who ran their own accounts and then married, and the accounts became their husband's property and the women became adjunct to the business they built, and I will not be that." "I know," he said. "You say that as though you had already thought about it." "I had," he said simply. She looked at him. The porch was cool, and the moon was up over the cedar brakes, and somewhere down the street someone was playing a fiddle, the kind of easy frontier tune that seemed to belong to summer evenings in a way that was inseparable from them. "And you are not troubled by it," she said. "I am not troubled by the fact that you are a person with a business and a set of opinions and a right to both," he said. "I would be troubled if you were not. I am not looking for a person to manage. I am looking for a person to be with." She was quiet for a moment, in the good kind of quiet that comes after something has been said right. "You are a surprising man," she said. "So I have been told," he said. "Generally it is not meant as a compliment." "I mean it as one," she said. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him. And they sat like that in the moonlight with the fiddle playing somewhere in the street and the cedar smelling of summer and the mules shifting in their paddock across the way. And it was, she thought, as uncomplicated as contentment ever was. They had their first argument in September. It was a real argument, not a spat, and it happened because of Delacroix. What Delacroix had done, after his conversation with Horatio Webb at the bank, was to shift his strategy. He could not pressure her account and he could not outbid her for her own route, but what he could do was approach the 3 settlements on her eastern run and offer them substantially lower rates than she charged, which was a losing price point for him, but not for long, because his intention, as Mary had suspected from the pattern, was to undercut independents until they collapsed and then raise his rates once the competition was gone. She discovered this through Clara Whittaker, who wrote her a letter in early September explaining that Delacroix had come to the settlement offering to take over the supply contract at 15% below Mary's rate, and that the Whittakers were too loyal to consider it, but that other settlements on the eastern run might not be. Mary was furious in the contained, specific way she got furious, which was worse than a visible anger because it did not dissipate. It calculated. She told Stephen about it over supper, laying out the situation clearly, and when she had finished, he said, "I know a lawyer in San Antonio, a man named Foster, who has been building a case against Delacroix's practices across 3 counties. If you sent your ledger to Foster, what you have documented would be useful to him." She looked at him. "I know about Foster," she said. "He contacted me 2 months ago." Stephen stilled. And I told him I would think about it." "Why are you still thinking about it?" "Because once I hand that ledger to a lawyer, it is out of my hands," she said, "and I do not like things important to me being out of my hands." He was quiet for a moment. "I understand that," he said, "but the lawyer has more reach than you do, and Delacroix is going to damage more people if this continues. Your ledger could stop that." "I know that," she said. "Then why exactly are you hesitating?" And there it was, the point of the argument, which was not really about the lawyer or the ledger, but about something more fundamental, which was whether she could trust another person with something she had built and documented and held onto for months, and whether trusting that person meant ceding control, and whether ceding control meant losing something essential about herself. "I am not hesitating because I do not understand the situation," she said, and her voice was cooler than she intended. "I am hesitating because I am allowed to take time with decisions that matter." "I did not say you were not allowed," he said, equally level. "I asked why. Because I asked why." "Because you told me the lawyer contacted you 2 months ago," he said, "and you are still thinking, and Delacroix is at the Whittaker settlement right now offering to undercut your livelihood, and I am struggling to understand what there is left to think about." She set down her fork. "Do not do that," she said quietly. "Do what?" "Make it sound simple when it is not simple for me." He looked at her and she could see him doing what she had come to know he did, which was hold himself still and think before he spoke, and she was grateful for it even at that moment. "You are right," he said. "I am sorry. I am not inside your reasoning and I should not pretend I am." She picked up her fork. They ate in a silence that was difficult but not hostile, and after a while she said, "I will write to Foster this week." He looked up. "Because of what I said?" "No," she said. "Because I had already decided, and I was using the argument to make sure I was deciding for my own reasons, and not because someone pushed me into it." He looked at her for a long time. "That is either the most logical or the most exasperating thing I have ever heard," he said. "Probably both," she agreed. She wrote to Foster that Friday and included a summary of the ledger with a promise to send the full document if he needed it. Foster wrote back within the week with an enthusiasm that suggested her documentation was exactly what he had been missing. In October, she said yes when Stephen asked her properly, on the road between Fredericksburg and Kerrville, which was perhaps not the most romantic location, but which she said afterward was entirely appropriate because it was where they had met and where the story had a kind of beginning, and he agreed that this was right. He had asked in the direct, unembellished way he did most things, without a great deal of ceremony, on horseback beside her wagon in the late afternoon, with the cedar brakes going gold and the limestone bluffs catching the light. And the question was simply whether she would marry him, and whether she would let him be the person beside her in the long way of it, and whether she thought that two people who both knew their own minds could make something that was better than either of them alone. She had said yes, and then after a moment she had said, "The business stays mine." "The business stays yours," he had said. "And if you want to add horse contracting to the root, we discuss it as equals." "As equals," he had agreed. "And I keep the ledger." "I would be worried if you did not," he said. She had laughed, and the sound of it went out across the cedar brakes into the clean October air, and the mules moved on with their patient steadiness, and the gray horse walked alongside, and the road stretched ahead into the golden afternoon. They were married in December of 1873 in the Fredericksburg Lutheran Church, which was small and solid and smelled of candle wax and pine, and the ceremony was attended by Heinrich Bauer and his wife, Ben Hollies from Careville, who came with his family, Clara Whittaker and Garrett, and a selection of the Whittaker settlement families including Ellis and Ruth Webb, who made the 2-day journey in their wagon, and arrived the evening before and stayed at the Ritter house. Because Mary had written specifically to say she wanted them there, and had arranged the lodging herself, Mrs. Trotman brought a cake. Mary's aunt came down from San Antonio and cried happy tears, and said nothing at all about parlors or husbands, which was its own kind of gift. Mary wore a cream-colored dress that she had made by a dressmaker in Fredericksburg, and it fit her the way she wanted things to fit, properly and without excess. And she stood in the church in the morning light with Stephen Ralston, and said what she meant and meant what she said. And when he looked at her in that careful amber way as the minister spoke, she felt the full weight and the full rightness of it without reservation. After the ceremony, at the dinner the settlement people and the Fredericksburg people shared in the hotel dining room, Ellis Webb stood and said a few words about Mary that were so direct and generous that she had to look at the tablecloth for a moment. And then Ruth Webb said something funny about a woman who could fix an axle and manage a ledger and still find time to fall in love. And the room laughed, and Stephen reached under the table and took her hand, and she let him. Because she had learned by now that letting him was not the same as needing him to, and that the difference was everything. The winter was a good one for settling in. They kept separate professional accounts because Mary had been very clear about this and Stephen had agreed entirely. But the house they lived in was her father's house on the west side of town, which was now theirs, and they added a paddock on the east side for the gray horse and 2 others that Stephen brought to stay while he worked his contracts, and the house was no longer too quiet in the evenings. He cooked, which she had not anticipated. He cooked with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, and the kitchen smelled different in the evenings now, better by her honest assessment, and she told him so, and he looked pleased in the contained way he expressed pleasure, and she found she liked very much being able to please him. She ran the freight route through the winter and into the spring of 1874, adding the eastern settlement run that she had been considering since the previous year. And the business grew in the steady, reliable way of things that are soundly built, not dramatically but durably. She hired a part-time driver in the spring, a steady young man named David Kessler from one of the German farming families, who drove the eastern run 3 times a month under her direction and proved to be exactly as reliable as he had appeared. Tom Delacroix's operation collapsed in March of 1874. Foster, the San Antonio lawyer, had built a case that went beyond freight manipulation into actual fraud, and the documentation Mary had provided was cited specifically in the proceedings that resulted in Delacroix losing his freight licenses in Gillespie, Kerr, and Bixar counties. She read about it in the San Antonio Herald and felt a satisfaction that was clean and uncomplicated, the satisfaction of a right outcome arrived at through patient and correct work. "Foster wrote to me," she told Stephen that evening at supper. "He said your cousin Asa intends to restart his route." "He told me," Stephen said. "He is going to need a good supplier. I told him to come to you." She looked at him. "You did not need to do that." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." There is a difference. She recognized the echo of their first meeting in this. The wire brace and the wedge, and the doing of a thing without requiring it to be requested. And she felt a particular warmth that she had learned by now was simply how she felt about him, which was constant and clear and entirely uncomplicated by the pride that other people had apparently decided defined her. She was not, she had come to understand, too proud to accept help. She was a person who had learned to be self-reliant because self-reliance had been necessary, and who had never been given help in the way that Stephen Ralston gave it, which was without condition or commentary, without making her feel that the help was a debt or a diminishment. He simply did things because they needed doing, and because doing them was within his capacity and because he wanted to, and the wanting was for its own sake, not as a transaction. This was a new thing in her life, and she did not take it for granted for one single day. The spring of 1874 brought other news as well, which was that Mary was expecting a child, and she received this information from the town doctor with the same calm attentiveness she brought to most information, and walked home and told Stephen over the kitchen table, and watched his face do something she had not seen it do before, which was open all the way. Not a smile exactly, but something more complete than a smile. Something that suggested all the careful reserve had simply and entirely and willingly given way. He reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his and held them and did not say anything for a moment, and then he said, "Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. "I intend to keep working through the summer. I will discuss the fall schedule with David Kessler." "Of course," he said. "I am telling you this because you should know, not because I am asking for an adjustment of the plan." "I understand," he said, and he did, and that was the thing she had never expected to find, a man who understood the difference between information and negotiation, between telling and asking, between sharing a life and losing one. She ran the route through the summer with the same competence she always had, adjusting the schedule in July when the heat made long runs inadvisable, and adding an extra rest day between trips. And she trained David Kessler on the western segment as backup. And she kept the ledger and managed the account, and had long conversations with Heinrich Bauer about pricing adjustments for the coming year. She also let Stephen drive her on some of the shorter runs, which was not because she could not drive them herself, but because she liked the company, and she told him this plainly, and he accepted it with a pleasure that was equally plain. Their son was born in November of 1874, in the house on the west side of Fredericksburg, attended by the doctor and Mrs. Trotman, who had appointed herself honorary grandmother without consulting anyone, and turned out to be exactly what was needed. Stephen was in the house through the whole of it, which was unusual by the customs of the time, and when the doctor finally opened the bedroom door and said it was done and all was well, he went in and held the child and held Mary's hand and said nothing at all, which was the right thing. They named the boy Robert James Ralston, Robert for her father and James for Stephen's younger brother who had not come home from the war. Robert James Ralston was, from the beginning, an alert and determined child with his mother's dark eyes, and his father's way of looking at things with complete attention before making any move whatsoever. He slept passably well and ate enthusiastically, and learned to walk by March of the following year, which the doctor said was early, and which neither of his parents found surprising. The house on the west side of Fredericksburg expanded its paddock in 1875 to accommodate 2 more horses, and the freight route expanded its schedule to 5 settlements by that fall, and David Kessler became a full-time employee, and by 1876 Mary had to add a second wagon. She handled this expansion with the methodical care that characterized everything she did, setting prices carefully, building relationships with each settlement's leadership, keeping every account balanced and every ledger clean. Stephen's horse business grew alongside it, in the cooperative and parallel way that they had always managed things, their accounts distinct and their decisions shared, their arguments real and their resolutions genuine. They argued twice more in those years, properly and with full investment, once about whether to accept a bank credit line for the wagon expansion, which she eventually took on her own terms after researching the rates exhaustively, and once about whether to move to a larger house, which ended with them building an addition to the existing house, because neither of them saw a sufficient reason to leave the place where Robert had been born. The addition gave them a proper study and a second bedroom, which became necessary in the winter of 1876, when they discovered that Robert would be sharing the house with a sibling by the following summer. Their second child, a boy named Thomas Ellis Ralston, arrived in June of 1877, and this time Mary went back to driving the short supply runs within 4 weeks, which caused the doctor to deliver a lecture and Mrs. Trotman to deliver a different kind of lecture, and Stephen to simply make sure the wagon was ready and properly loaded before she went, which was the kind of help she had come to understand was simply part of the shape of her life. Thomas Ellis was different from Robert from the beginning, louder and more immediately expressive, the kind of child who communicated everything he felt with immediate clarity, which Mary found both exhausting and completely endearing. He was Stephen's expression in miniature, the same lines, the same wide brow, but with her directness delivered at a volume that the household was still adjusting to 2 years in. Robert took Thomas under his older brother authority with the seriousness of a child who had always treated responsibility as important, and by the time Thomas was walking, Robert could generally be found 2 steps behind him, preventing the worst of the likely disasters. The years moved in the good, full way of years that are lived on purpose. Ellis and Ruth Webb expanded their farm in the valley and became one of the most prosperous agricultural operations in that part of Kerr County, and Mary carried their goods to market on favorable terms and was proud to do it. And when some people on the trade routes made comments about whose goods she was transporting, she answered them in her direct and level way, and the comments stopped. Because Mary Vaughn had by 1877 a reputation in the Hill Country trade network that was not to be trifled with, Clara Whittaker wrote a letter in the spring of 1878 that made Mary read it twice. Clara had been appointed the first female member of the Whittaker Settlement Council, a development that was apparently contested by 2 of the older male members, and entirely unsurprising to everyone who actually knew Clara. Stephen read the letter over her shoulder at the kitchen table, with Thomas on his knee and Robert building something architectural out of firewood on the floor. Clara Whittaker will manage those 2 old men in about 45 minutes, he said. 40, Mary said. Asa Good, Stephen's cousin, had rebuilt his freight operation out of the Kerrville area after Delacroix's collapse, and he and Mary had developed a working relationship that involved coordinating routes to avoid overlap and occasionally sharing supply contacts, which was mutually beneficial, and which Asa had first suggested in a letter that began, "My cousin tells me you are the most organized person currently operating on the Fredericksburg Trace, and I would like to discuss business." Mary had written back, "Your cousin is not wrong, and when can you come to Fredericksburg?" Asa Good turned out to be a small, wiry man with Stephen's amber eyes and a sense of humor that was considerably more visible than his cousin's, and he and Mary liked each other immediately with the uncomplicated directness of 2 people who respect competence and have no patience for ceremony. "You saved my route," Asa said, the first time they met properly in Heinrich Bauer's store. "Foster and his lawyers saved your route," Mary said. "I gave them the tools." "That is a distinction without much practical difference," Asa said. "There is a great practical difference," she said. "One attributes to me agency I did not exercise, and the other credits me with what I actually did, which was keep careful records. I prefer accuracy. Asa looked at her and then at Stephen, who was standing by the door with the expression of a man watching something he could have predicted. "She is exactly as you described," Asa said to his cousin. "Yes," Stephen said simply. "What did you say?" Mary asked. "That you know your business better than anyone on this trace," Stephen said, "and that your handwriting is remarkably consistent for someone who does ledger work by lamplight." She looked at him for a moment and then made herself not smile, which she mostly managed. By 1879, the Vaughn freight operation, which had remained in Mary's name throughout and which would continue to do so, had grown to 3 wagons, 6 mules, 2 full-time drivers, and a supply network that reached 8 settlements across 3 counties. Mary ran the business from the study in the house on the west side of Fredericksburg, with the ledger system she had built over 6 years, and she went out on the road herself twice a month on the 2 runs she preferred, the Careville Trace and the Whitaker Run, because she had no intention of becoming an administrator who had forgotten what the road felt like. Stephen ran his horse business with a steady roster of ranching clients across the hill country and occasionally as far as Austin, and Robert, at 4½, was already following him around the paddock with the careful attention of a child who intends to learn everything about horses as quickly as possible, and Thomas, at 2, was following Robert with the equally determined energy of a child who intends to do everything his brother does, faster and louder. One morning in September of 1879, on the Careville Trace, Mary was driving the familiar road through the cedar breaks in the limestone country, alone in the good way rather than the lonely way, with the fall light on the hills and the smell of the season turning, and she found herself thinking, with the clarity of a thought that has been forming for years and has finally arrived complete, about the chain of events that had led to this particular morning on this particular road. A wheel had broken. A man had stopped. He had not offered to help, not in so many words, not in the way that created obligation or implied incompetence. He had simply assessed the situation and applied what was needed and stepped back. And the thing that had seemed like a small act of practicality on a dusty road had been, in the way that small acts sometimes are, the first link in something that ran all the way to 2 boys asleep in a stone house in Fredericksburg, and a man who would have coffee ready when she came home, and a business that was hers, and a life that was hers and shared and full. She had been called too proud to accept help by 3 different people in the years she had been running the route alone, and she had always known the call was not quite accurate, because the issue had never been pride but something more specific, which was that she had never been offered help that did not come with a cost, a debt, or an expectation or a diminishment. She had not been unwilling to receive. She had simply never been given. And then a man named Stephen Ralston had not given her help, but had simply done a necessary thing with a wire brace and a metal wedge. And the difference between those 2 things, the giving of help with its implications and the quiet doing of what was needed without naming it anything at all, was the difference between her life before that road and her life after it. She drove into Careville in the mid-morning with the freight order ready and the ledger balanced, and the road behind her clean and familiar, and Ben Holly's came out of his smithy as she pulled up, because she always stopped at Ben Holly's smithy when she came through Careville, to check the wheels and the axle housings, a habit she had developed after the first year and never given up. "Mary Ralston," Ben said, with the genuine warmth he had extended to her since the day she first walked in with Stephen's brace on her axle. "Mary Vaughn," she said pleasantly. "Mary Vaughn Ralston," he said, with the careful precision of a man who had learned to be precise. She laughed. "That will do," she said. He looked at the wheels with his practiced eye and found nothing to concern him, which was the expected result of a well-maintained wagon on a well-driven route, and she continued on to complete the deliveries, and was back on the road south by early afternoon with the light behind her and ahead of her and everywhere. She got home to Fredericksburg as the evening was coming on, and she could smell wood smoke from 2 streets away and knew that Stephen had the stove going, and when she came in through the back door, she found him at the kitchen table with Robert on his knee reading something from a wide-paged primer, and Thomas asleep on the settle by the wall with a wooden horse clutched in both hands. Stephen looked up at her with that careful, warm, amber regard that had not changed since the first time she saw it on a dusty road in April of 1873. "Good trip," he said. "Good trip," she said. "Ben says the wheels are fine." "They should be," he said. "I checked the right rear hub before you left." She set down her satchel. "Did you?" she said. "You were talking to David Kessler about the schedule," he said without any self-consciousness, "and the pin had come slightly loose, so I tightened it." She looked at him standing there with their son on his knee and the stove warm behind him and the other boy sleeping with his wooden horse, and she felt the full, uncomplicated, boundless thing that she felt for this man, which she had given up trying to make smaller or more manageable, because it was the size it was and it was the right size. "You did it before I could object," she said. "I did it before you could notice," he said. "There is a difference," she said. "A small one," he agreed, and he was almost smiling. She crossed the kitchen and bent and kissed him, which Robert greeted with a 5-year-old's magnificent indifference, and the stove crackled and Thomas slept on with his wooden horse, and outside the window the hill country evening came down soft and cool and full of cedar, and the particular amber light of the last sun caught the limestone and turned it gold, and on the road north toward Kerrville the trace was empty and clean and waiting for morning. Robert James Ralston grew up to be a horseman like his father, quiet and sure-handed, with his mother's orderly mind applied to the breeding and training of quarter horses, and he eventually took over the contracting business from Stephen with the same easy competence that characterized everything he did. He married a schoolteacher from New Braunfels named Hannah Fisher in 1896 and had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and the oldest boy was named Stephen after his grandfather, which Stephen Ralston received with more genuine emotion than he generally showed, standing in the parlor of the West Side house with the child in his arms, and an expression that Mary recognized from the November morning in 1874, when she had first put Robert in his hands. Thomas Ellis Ralston turned out to be exactly what his childhood suggested, loud and warm and possessed of a relentless energy that he eventually channeled into law, of all things, reading it under a San Antonio attorney and passing his bar in 1898. He argued his first case in Kerr County and came home to Fredericksburg afterward full of opinions about the legal system and the things that needed changing within it. And Mary sat across the supper table and listened with great pleasure, because this was the kind of table she had always meant to set, one where the conversation was real and the arguments were honest, and the people around it knew their own minds. She ran the Vaughn freight operation until 1900, when she sold it to David Kessler's family at a price she had determined was fair and not a dollar less, having negotiated the terms herself over 6 weeks of careful correspondence. She kept the ledgers. She kept every one of them, in a neat row on the shelf in the study, 27 years of accounts in her handwriting and her father's, and she would sometimes sit in the study in the evenings and run her hand along their spines and feel the solidity of a thing built carefully over time. Stephen was still working horses at 60, or the edges of it, the consultation and the evaluation if not the breaking, and he had a reputation across central Texas that was based entirely on his actual record, which was long and clean and consistent. His gray horse was many years in the past, succeeded by other horses, each of them chosen with the same care, but the gray was the one that came up sometimes in conversation, the blaze-faced quarter horse on the Kerrville Trace in the spring of 1873, standing with patient stillness while its rider crouched in the dirt and looked at a cracked axle housing. On a spring evening in 1902, almost 30 years from the day they had met on the road, Mary and Stephen sat on the porch of the West Side house in the Long Hill country dusk, and the cedar brakes were greening, and the mockingbirds were going through their repertoire as they always did, and the grandchildren were somewhere in the house making the sounds that grandchildren make when they believe no adult is paying sufficient attention. "I have been thinking," Mary said. He looked at her, the amber still clear in his eyes, the careful attention undiminished by 30 years of being applied to her. "About what?" "About the wire brace," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he made the sound she recognized as the contained laugh, warm and real. "The wire brace," he said. "You never asked me," she said. "You just looked at the housing and said what needed to be done and went and got the wire." "I remember," he said. "I have thought about that many times," she said. "The way you did not make it into a request or a favor, you just did it." "The axle needed bracing," he said. "That was not all it was," she said. He looked at her in the dusk, with the cedars behind him and the grandchildren loud somewhere in the house, and the long golden light on the limestone hills. "No," he agreed. "It was not all it was." She reached across and took his hand, and he turned it over and held hers properly, in the way he always had, like something he intended to keep. And the evening settled around them with the full particular sweetness of an evening that is one of many and knows itself to be precious for exactly that reason. The hill country lay around them in the spring of 1902 as it always had, red dirt roads through cedar breaks, limestone bluffs catching the last of the light. The settlements spread out across the valleys where people had built things meant to last. And in the stone house on the west side of Fredericksburg, with the ledgers on the shelf in the study, and the horses in the paddock and the grandchildren filling the rooms with noise and aliveness, the life that had begun with a broken wheel and a length of wrap wire, and a man who did not call it help went on in the good, full, sturdy way of lives that were built deliberately, by two people who each knew their own mind, and had chosen, every day since a dusty road in April of 1873, to know it together.